Hello, Dan Tippens.
Hello, Dan Kaufman.
Welcome to the Sophia audience. I am here with my partner in crime, or one of my partners in crime, my younger partner in crime. I think
just the young.
Do I?
I think I'm just the younger version of you, by the way.
Yeah.
Younger partner in crime. It just turns out to be yourself.
That's scary. I'm here with my younger partner in crime, Dan Tippens, who, beyond being co-founder of the Electric Agora and editor, also now is a doctoral student in philosophy at the University of Miami.
Took long enough, man.
So he's going to join the legions of unemployable, overly educated people.
I'm looking forward to having that as my permanent resume.
It'll say on there, unemployable and educated, right?
Someone who formerly had hope.
All right. So today what we're going to talk about is, so you and I both wrote essays that touch on a common topic, although they're very different essays. I wrote one first. It was called Morality Everywhere. And then you wrote one called The Scope of Morality, which actually is the most recent thing posted on the Electric Agora. And I think the topic is really interesting, and I thought it'd be a good topic for a conversation. So maybe what we could do is you could start with this sort of describing the problem that both you and I have touched upon.
Yeah.
And then we can go from there. What I want to do is really sort of talk to you about your essay. Your essay is lengthier and much more in detail. Mine is sort of sketchy and a bit of a rant. Yours is more meaty.
Mine's more from someone who's still trying to make it in the career.
Right. So you don't call anybody a fucking moron in yours. Actually, I don't either.
Yeah. I should also say, so the audience knows there's a kind of a story behind this, in the sense that I think, you and I have been talking about this kind of stuff for a long time, and eventually we just realized that we kind of had the same view, just from slightly different angles.
Yeah.
And so at a certain point, we just decided, why have we not written about this?
Right.
But yes, I'm happy to start with the problem.
So why don't you tell me let's call it, for at least for now, until we get some of your technical terminology that you've introduced to try and make sense of this. Let's tell us what the morality everywhere problem is, and then we can start talking about it within your the framework that you set up.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, we both did slightly different essays. And so the morality everywhere problem that I set up is predominantly a philosophical one that has societal kind of implications. But for you, there's kind of there's like a philosophical and I think a personal component that's frustrating, or that's kind of a problem for you. But basically, the idea is, the thing that's the problem is all sorts of quotidian things that people engage in are being moralized. And by moralized here, I just mean, people being reprimanded and told they ought not do certain things that are very, very ordinary in people's lives. So, for example, you wrote in your essay a list. You gave a list of kind of some of the things that that people have been moralizing, which are clearly mundane. And let me just read this off. I think it's useful just to go with the actual quote.
Sure.
What one eats and drinks and wears and watches and listens to. What sort of car one drives to work, or even that one drives to work. What sort of job one has. How one spends one's spending money. What sort of apartment or house or neighborhood one lives in. Whether one uses gendered pronouns or words like brother, sister, uncle, and the like in one's ordinary conversations. Even what one thinks to oneself, entirely separate from one's behavior. Now, to put this into context, in case people don't know, all the things that you're describing are things that currently are tied to pretty, we'll say loud activist circles. What one eats and one drinks is pretty prevalent in the animal activist circle. What sort of car one drives to work is in the climate change kind of domain. what sort of job one has. Peter Singer's talked about this, right? The kind of job that you should have is one that will allow you to kind of do the most good for other people by donating money.
Right. That's the effective altruism movement.
That's the effective altruism. Yeah.
Right.
How one spends when spending money, as you said in the essay, in your essay, you talk about how Peter Unger from NYU, makes this kind of expresses this kind of concern about how you spend your spending money. So all of these, and of course
the pronouns is the pronouns is the trans activists.
Yeah. And it extends to more than just the pronouns as well. This also goes into issues of sexism and sometimes even racial issues. So with the sexism stuff, for example, if you refer to an adult female as a girl, that could be reprimanded as being sexist because girl implies some kind of youthful adolescence, whereas obviously she's a woman or something like something like that. So this stuff is pretty pervasive these days. It's kind of all over the place. The thing that is kind of shared between all of these activities, as you note, is they're all ordinary things. They're all very mundane. They take places in domains of life that aren't rare, and we're probably going to encounter all the time. What you eat or drink, you're going to be eating and drinking every day.
Right.
What kind of spending you do with your spending money, that's going to be something that you're going to do all the time, be thinking about. What sort of apartment you have, how you refer to people. These are just things that are quotidian, right? We all engage in these behaviors. So that's, I'd say, something that kind of encompasses them, is their mundane nature.
Okay, so what in your... You have a certain technical vocabulary that you developed to talk about this. So what's the name that you've given for this phenomenon, and does it tie with any sort of prevalent or well-known moral philosophies, or is this just sort of like a folk tradition that's risen up, or is this actually something that one finds in moral philosophy?
So this is something that one finds in moral philosophy, and it's strange because it's actually right up in your face, but it's not really discussed very much. And I actually have an explanation for why I think that is. But basically, I call this this view that I'm criticizing, which is based off of the kinds of societal features that we just discussed about moralizing quotidian things. I call it the universal moral status view. And the claim is that all actions have some moral status. So moral status here typically just means, what the moral valence of an action is. So it can be impermissible, it can be obligatory, it can be permissible, it can be supererogatory, meaning goes above and beyond the call of duty. These are all...
It is in some ways bound up with obligation.
Yeah, it's in some ways bound up with obligation. And by the way, it's important to note that I include permissibility here as being a moral status. So an action being permissible, morally permissible, means it still has a status. It's just, allowed.
Yeah.
The reason that's important is because I actually think that explains why, despite the fact that the universal moral status view is pretty prevalent in, some contemporary moral theories, it hasn't really been discussed that much.
Yeah, it's now that you say it, that's really kind of interesting. I had not thought of that before, because normally you think of, there's there's prohibited and obligatory and then supererogatory. But then, of course, there is, if you think about it in common, ordinary ways of thinking, there is such a thing as something simply being permissible.
Yeah.
Which means it's neither obligatory nor supererogatory, and yet somehow it still has a moral color, right? It's something that's permitted. You're being permitted to do
exactly.
Something, right?
Exactly.
And that's interesting because I guess what you're saying is that people are shoving a lot of stuff in. People, in order to give things a moral status, are shoving a lot of things into that permissible kind of.
Yeah. That's what I think. I think people have failed to recognize any distinction between something lacking a moral status and something being permissible.
Yeah. Or is there a negative version of permissible? So, is there that's not forbidden, but it's sort of not. It's also not on, so to speak.
Not forbidden, but not on. Yeah, I'm not sure. But I should say one thing that's kind of interesting is actually, so when I presented this to Michael Sloat here at Miami,
who, for people who don't know, is a very prominent, influential ethicist at the University of Miami, works mostly in virtue ethics. I guess he's a contemporary virtue ethicist. He
does a lot of virtue ethics. He also does care ethics, and right now I think he's dabbling into some kind of Eastern philosophy to see how it overlaps. But he's been
you talked to him about this?
Yeah, so I talked to him about this, and it was interesting because at first, his first reaction was, so when I presented the universal moral status view, I just said, the claim that all actions have a moral status. He said, "Oh, that's either trivial or false." Okay, and I said, "What do you mean?" And his
That's utilitarianism, man. What are you talking about?
right, right. Well, he thinks utilitarianism is obviously wrong. But here's what I mean. Here's what I mean. When I said, he said, I'm sorry. I essentially said like, I don't think, for example, that all actions have the status of being permissible, obligatory, impermissible, etc. And he said, whoa, if you include permissibility in there, it's trivially true that all actions have a moral status because whatever is not obligatory is simply permissible. And so then I stopped him and I said, I don't think so. And I presented the arguments in the paper and he said, this sounds plausible. He didn't necessarily agree, but he took it seriously. So since Sloat, also seemed to conflate permissible and lack of status, I think it's a good explanation for why people haven't discussed this.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. I mean, is tying my shoes permissible or is it just nothing? Right? It's just
right.
Yeah, it's very weird to describe it as permissible, right? I mean that's strange.
Yes. And by the way, so we should say, we were talking about what the problem is here. What we've been discussing just now is simply the view, the view that I think is wrong. And again, there are philosophical and practical problems associated with the view that you and I think are going to discuss, in tandem. I think my stuff's a lot more about the philosophy and why this is philosophically problematic. And I think a lot of your stuff has to do with the practical problems with this and why it's untenable in kind of a social framework.
Yeah, mine is sort of like why you should hate these people, and yours is more like a calm, rational disputation with these people. See, I'm like, push these people down flights of stairs, and you're like, this is why these people are wrong.
If the two of us were like two homunculi in someone's brain, we'd constitute a good person. You know what I mean?
The devil and the red guy on the shoulder and the little white guy on the shoulder. So, before you get on to what's wrong with this, you do think this view is actually entailed by utilitarianism, right? So
yeah.
For the utilitarian, every action does have a moral status. Can you explain why?
Yeah, so they simply state, and by the way, the funny thing is utilitarian can be easily amended to solve this problem, but they explicitly state, for all actions, the action that one ought to perform, that one is obligated to perform, is the one that maximizes happiness. That would be like some kind of hedonic utilitarianism.
Yeah.
But basically, it's some version of that. It's any action that you take. It's it's right and good, just insofar as it maximizes some utility principle of happiness or whatever.
Yeah.
Or desire satisfaction, who knows. But the idea is that clearly states it operates over all actions. It's clearly saying for all actions, any one that you perform, you need to do the one that maximizes happiness. Now, the thing that's interesting, by the way, is this is reflected quite clearly in the quote that I give by Eric Schwitzgebel.
I was going to ask you to read that. At the beginning of the essay, you have a quotation from Eric Schwitzgebel, who is also who's not at the level of a Sloat, but he's a younger generation that's going to become like that. I mean, he publishes quite a lot, and he's got a public intellectual presence as well.
Yeah,
is he himself a utilitarian?
I'm actually not sure. I wish that I would have looked, but I can't say for certain.
Okay, well, we'll also.
I'm very tempted to think so, considering this quote. But I can't say definitively. I should say also that Schwitzgebel is also, he's an extremely kind professor. I actually, when I was applying to graduate schools, I cold emailed him just to ask him for assistance, and
he helped you.
And he helped me. He didn't know me at all.
That's a rare thing.
So I was glad that he took every decision to be a moral, or every action to have a moral status when I emailed.
You're glad that he holds the universal moral status view. You just don't want to hold yourself.
Exactly.
So why don't you read the quote, and we will link to the full piece from which the quote comes so that people can see it in its context. But why don't you go ahead and read the quote from Schwitzgebel?
Yeah.
Describes the sense in which utilitarianism believes in universal moral status, as you've called it.
Yeah, so it goes like this. Every decision is a moral decision. Every dollar you spend on yourself is a dollar that could instead be donated to a good cause. Every minute you spend is a minute you could have done something more kind or helpful than what you actually did. Every person you see, you could greet warmly or grumpily, give them a kind word or not bother. Of course, it's exhausting to think this way, but still, there is, I believe, no such thing as a morally innocent choice. So as you can see, right, I mean, the reason I picked this is it's the clearest expression of the view. Right?
Very clear, yeah.
Basically, Schwitzgebel just said, you know, my impression is he took what was an implicit kind of hovering around view and just said, I'm going to explicitly state it now. This is actually what I think, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, he even mentioned some of the things that you talk about as being quotidian, the kind of things that people moralize, right? Every dollar that you spend could have been spent going to a good cause. You could have been more kind every minute that you spend with someone, right? Or not. And now he talks in the language of decision, but I think we can easily just translate this into the language of action. Because typically decisions are just talking about the action that you take, one or another. So yeah, this to me strikes me as a pervasive view. Certain moral theories are committed to it, such as utilitarianism, I think at least, as they're currently stated. You know, you by the way, so we talked about this. You're not necessarily convinced that Kant's view of morality is committed to UMS. Do you think he actually may have been, you know, among the modern philosophers, you know, one of the people to deny universal moral status?
Well, I just know that Kant, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, certainly for Kant, there are a class of actions that have no moral status. I mean, those are the, you know, he says that when you act in, you know, when you do the right thing but for the wrong reason, that's what he calls acting in accordance with duty as opposed to acting from duty, that your action is not bad because you've done what duty requires, but it's also not morally to be admired because you didn't do it for the right reason. And for Kant, the reason is the sole morally relevant feature of an action. And so I would just sort of deduce from that he believes that at least there can be a class of actions.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, he's also going to say, though, that, you know, you should have acted for the right reason, right? So, I mean, it's sort of tricky. But I don't really know. I mean, I don't know that it matters that we have to do a survey of all the philosophies.
No.
Which ones entail this or not. In other words, I think it's fine to simply oppose UMS. And then whichever theory has a problem with it is going to have to, you know, clean their own kitchen, right? I mean,
the thing that's funny, by the way, is I don't even think any theory needs to have. There's no deep philosophical problem. So any theory that has UMS built into it, all they need to do is unbuild it into it and just say, you know, like utilitarianism would just have to say, all actions that have a status, do the one that is, you know.
Yeah, but that's a sort of a problem because isn't utilitarianism, the nature of it commits it to the idea that everything has a status, because for the utilitarian, what makes an action right is the extent to which it increases the general happiness. And you could argue that every action, and certainly every action choice, implicates people's happiness one way or the other. So either I'm doing something that doesn't, and I should be doing something that does instead.
Yeah.
Or I'm doing something that does, but it affects it negatively, which means I should be doing something else. Yeah. Or I doing something which does in the positive way, but there's something else I could be doing that would do it even more, right?
Yeah.
In other words, I guess I don't see how a utilitarian avoids it.
I think what would have to take place is, and we're going to get into this later, is a philosophical discussion about what gives something you know, what brings an action into the moral domain at all, what gives an action a status, and then what determines that status once the action has one. So I think, for example, the utilitarian could just say, look, I give the answer to the second question. What gives the thing a status once it's got one? But what gives it a status in the first place doesn't have to do with consequences.
You mean what gives it a determinate status once it has one, positive or negative?
Yeah.
But see, this is what strikes me as a bit difficult, and I mean, we don't want to go on this too long because it's sort of off the topic, but at least the topic we had in front of us. But I mean, what a moral theory is an effort is a theory that's supposed to give you the general properties of rightness and wrongness, right? The necessary and sufficient conditions for something being right and something being wrong. Now that is, in a sense, telling you what features something has to have a moral status, and the problem is that these features that they identify are features that are, in many ways, are ubiquitous, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's almost as if what we want to say is there's two levels of status. One is whether it's even a subject of moral inquiry at all.
Yeah.
And then once it is, what's its moral valence, positive or negative, right?
And this is
I'm wondering if moral theories actually have the capacity to disambiguate those two.
That's this is actually a really good question. So there's, by the way, I should also say this paper that I wrote for the Agora is one that I'm trying to develop for a professional publication. And so this conversation is in part almost like a little workshop for me.
And you're actually going to do a workship with it at school, right?
I am doing a workshop. So as of now, it's scheduled for next month. But some of this is going to. I'm assuming that some of this dialogue will bring up new content that I hadn't really thought of before.
Right.
So
what I was saying was, do moral theories really have? I'm not sure that they have.
Right. So I was going to say this was something that I wanted to. This was one of the things actually that I was planning on researching in the next month. So you might remember in my essay, I kind of introduce my view by looking at David Hume. And David Hume has a particular theory of, what David Hume likes to do. Hume loves to do like psychological accounts of various philosophical phenomena. And in this, what was this? Was this Inquiry into Human Understanding? Yeah. The section of justice. He goes over the...
That would be Inquiry into the Principles of Morals.
Okay, Inquiry into the Principles of Morals. Thanks.
It's not from the treatise.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So yeah, he goes into the essentially the psychological origins of distributive justice. Distributive justice here, obviously just being the right way to distribute scarce resources amongst people. And he points out that there are some necessary conditions for just questions of justice to even arise, or as he puts it, for us to even entertain the idea of justice at all. And the idea is this. So he points out, for example, look, if there's no scarcity of any resources at all, resources here being things that people desire or want or have to have, if there's no scarcity at all, no one's going to ever think of the concept of justice. The idea will never arise in the mind at all. For him, he also puts it, the cautious, jealous virtue of justice would never have been dreamed of, right?
So it's questions of, so just to be clear, moral questions of distributive justice only arise in conditions of scarcity.
Yeah. And some other ones that he mentions, but scarcity is, I think, the most obvious example. And here's, just to illuminate it for the listener, he gives a really good example, which is, look, when you go outside and you take a breath of fresh air, do you think about justice? Do you think about whether or not you taking that air was taking someone else's property that they had a right to?
Right.
Do you think that this is, an unfair acquisition of resources? No, you don't entertain the notion of justice at all. It doesn't enter your mind. And the reason is because it's not a scarce resource. It could very well become one in the future.
If you were on Mars, if you were in a colony on Mars, in an artificial environment where the air is very precious, and then it could be as a matter of fact, there's science fiction that I can think of. I actually just read a story by Robert Heinlein in which air is very expensive, and the use of it is very heavily regulated precisely.
Yeah.
Scarce resource, and there's questions of distributive justice that arise. So yes, that makes perfect sense.
Now, the reason I bring it up is because what you can see is what Hume is doing is just talking about when issues of justice come up at all. But at least in that section, he doesn't give you any answer as to how resources ought to be distributed.
Right. So there's a very clear case of the two concepts disambiguated.
Yes.
One concept being, is this action or whatever it is we're considering even a subject of moral consideration at all? That's one question. Then the second question is, if the answer is yes, what is its moral valence? Is it just or unjust? Is it fair or unfair, et cetera, et cetera? The point is that in order for the latter question to even arise, the first question has to have been answered in the affirmative, right?
Yes, and so
right.
Yeah, and so I was going to say, the thing is, this is I was bringing this up to try and address your earlier question about, can moral theories really disambiguate these questions, right? Now, the interesting thing is, Hume clearly has done it,
right,
with justice here. But the interesting thing is Hume explicitly states that he thinks that justice is an artificial virtue, whereas morality is in some sense a natural one. Now, this is the future direction of research that I have to look into, because I'm not sure if this will matter for my purposes, because Hume essentially is saying that justice is, kind of constructed by people. The concept is constructed by people for practical purposes. And he wants to say that morality isn't exactly like that. And this is why he calls the one an artificial virtue, constructed, versus the moral stuff a natural virtue. So it could be the case.
Give an example, just so the audience who doesn't know this material, give an example of a natural virtue.
Oh, well, so this, I'm assuming a natural virtue would be something that's a little bit more like ingrained in people and isn't just something we've constructed for.
Like a virtue that arises out of sympathy or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, exactly. So, some kind of empathy.
Benevolence or non-maleficence or something like that would be a natural virtue.
Which are a lot of the things that we talk about in morality.
Right.
Moral consideration. So it could be the case that Hume can do precisely this inquiry because this is artificial virtue, justice.
Right.
And maybe you can't disambiguate the questions with regard to natural virtues, which is more than about.
That's something I have to think about.
Yeah, this is why it's a future direction of research for me, because I don't know the answer to that right now. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah. All right. So then let's move on to what's wrong with UMS. So what's wrong with the utilitarian who is busily setting about instructing you or instructing anyone on all these obligations that operate over every single element of their life, every step they take, every breath they make, I feel like isn't there a police song? Every breath you take. Anyway, what's wrong with this?
Yeah. So
your view, what's wrong with this? And I have my own views about what's wrong with it. What's your view? What's wrong with it?
I want to say that I think you and I come at this question, like we said before, from different angles. And mine is more, the view can't explain certain things, philosophically speaking.
Okay.
It can't do certain philosophical work that I think needs to be done. So there are two things that I point to. The first is I adopt Hume's kind of intuition about there being a difference between lacking an intuition on something or lacking any kind of, feelings about justice or lacking any notions of justice at all, and having an intuition that some kind of distribution of resources is just. Similarly, the idea for me is there's a difference between lacking an intuition about something having any moral status at all and having some moral intuition, whether that be that the thing's obligatory or permissible even. So here would be the example.
Wait, so is the problem just the one we mentioned earlier, and that is we want to be able to make a distinction between the status of tying my shoelaces.
Yeah.
And exactly. So we don't want to be forced to say that things like that are permissible.
Exactly. I was just about to get to this. I mean, so things like, for example, rolling out of your bed on the right or the left side, humming to the radio while you drive, greeting someone with hello as opposed to hey. It doesn't, on my view, given that we lack any moral sentiments at all when we do these things, it doesn't have a moral status. Because when we think that things are permissible, we have actually overt moral sentiments about permissibility. So think about the trolley problem, right? Which everyone loves to go to. When students will give you their intuitions, one, for example, they hesitate. But second, at least myself, introspectively, when I have an intuition that it's permissible, say, to push the fat man or whatever in front of the trolley to save the five, if I had that intuition of permissibility, there is an overt moral sentiment. And part of that sentiment, for me at least, in the trolley problem case, is a feeling of, like regret if I were to do it.
Right.
And so even intuitions of permissibility still involve some moral sentiment. It's just not the same moral sentiment as obligatory.
Right.
Whereas things like rolling out of the right side or the left side of the bed, I just don't think about morality. It doesn't come up. And on the utilitarian view, there's no distinction to be made here. And that, to me, strikes me as wrong, especially because a lot of these moral theories, on their, the way that they're supported is through moral intuition, right? We have intuitions about cases, and then they construct these theories. My view is, if you're taking intuition seriously, you should take lack of intuition seriously as well.
Yeah. So
that's one argument, by the way. I'll get into the next one in a second, which is related.
Right. Yeah. So on the UMS view, we can't make an important distinction. And that is between things that simply have no moral status at all, as opposed to things that are, let's say, permissible or impermissible, that sort of have the weakest sort of moral status.
Yeah.
UMS tends to just simply lump all together all these trivialities and mundane things that we normally think of as having no moral status. What they do is they classify them as sort of having the weakest form of moral status. They're either permissible or impermissible. And there just seems something absurd about describing tying one's shoelaces as permissible, as opposed to simply not having any moral status whatsoever, and that the person who holds UMS can't make this distinction.
Yes, and this relates very closely to the second kind of argument that I make, which I think will illuminate the view even more. And this has to do with explaining certain kinds of moral disagreement.
Okay.
Because essentially, so here's the idea. In the essay, I say, let's take two different kinds of moral disagreement that are going on right now. One is the case of abortion, and one is the case of the ethics of comedy, professional comedy here. Right.
Okay. So you have to say something a little bit about the latter, because everybody knows about the former. But what's the moral question about comedy?
Yep. So the moral question about comedy is comedians very recently, have been essentially getting morally reprimanded by people who think that they're making socially insensitive jokes. So if you make a joke, for example, about the kind of disempowerment of African Americans, or if you make a joke about sexual harassment in the workplace for women, things like that, kind of socially sensitive issues, you're doing something wrong. Making those jokes is morally impermissible, even in the professional comedy arena, not just in ordinary life, but even in the professional comedy arena, right? And so,
how is this? Is this just a few? Is this just like a few hairy campus activists like getting worked up, or is this like an actual thing?
There's an actual thing, I think. So, for example, very recently I saw an article in Salon, which was, have you noticed that on Netflix there have been a lot of stand-up comedy shows that have been popping up? So Louis C.K. had one, Dave Chappelle had one, and I'm sure some other people did too. But they've been kind of investing heavily in the stand-up scene. And Salon published an article about, I think it was Dave Chappelle's sketch. Yeah, Dave Chappelle stand-up. And Dave Chappelle made a joke about trans people in the military because Trump had, done his trans ban recently. And Dave Chappelle made some kind of joke. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was some kind of joke that obviously is like, I think it was questioning whether or not trans identity is, legitimate in some way in the joke, right? Or the joke plays on this, ambiguity about whether or not this disagreement. And so he got Salon blasted, right? Like Salon published this article that was just like, Dave Chappelle is essentially such an asshole for doing this, right? And this was morally wrong, and he doesn't know the harm that this causes to the trans community.
So this is pretty, I mean, I don't know what the word I want to describe, but I mean, I'm old enough now. I mean, this is pretty, what you just described is pretty mild stuff. I mean, watch Eddie Murphy's Delirious. I mean, half of it is jokes about homosexuals. Yeah. And some very funny ones. I mean, he does a sketch about the honeymooners imagining Ralph Cramden and Ed Norton as gay lovers, which is just absolutely hilarious. Sam Kinison, one of those funniest sketches is about famine in Africa. I always thought,
you're going to get reprimanded just for saying that.
The thing is that I don't care. I was under the impression that half the point of comedy was that comedy comes out of tragedy, right? I mean that's
right.
You either laugh or you cry, right? I mean. Yeah. So what is this part of like an organized effort to sort of make comedy PC, or is this just a piecemeal kind of reaction that's happening on campuses here and there, or?
It's a good question. I mean, for example, I don't know if one thing that you're asking is there like a dedicated activist group for like ethics or like comedy ethics in the same way that there are activist groups for trans rights?
Right.
I don't think so. I think it's more like the trans rights, women's rights, racial rights activists, the LGBTQ plus African American activist communities, all on the side, so to speak, on their side time, also criticize this stuff because one of the things that they're interested in is kind of monitoring speech that could be offensive or harmful to the standing of these groups in some way.
Especially in the popular culture, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, especially in the popular culture.
Okay, so these are two examples of moral issues. One is the comedy issue, which is relatively recent, and the other is the abortion question, which obviously is decades upon decades old and is very well understood. We don't need to go over that. Now, you're arguing that the person who holds UMS, universal moral status, can't make a certain crucial distinction between types of moral problems. So now talk through that with these two examples.
So it has to do with the way that the two different opposing factions kind of disagree with one another. The kinds of responses that they give. So let's take the comedy debate. One side's going to say, look, you shouldn't make these jokes because they're socially insensitive and they harm this group in one way or another. It's punching down in some way, right?
Okay.
You shouldn't do it. The other side says, frequently you'll hear, learn to take a joke. It's just a joke. Stop being so sensitive. Quit being a snowflake. Or some other kind of thing that indicates that the action that people are morally reprimanding is in some sense trivial, right?
Gotcha.
Now, in the abortion debate, no one says, dude, you should totally just learn to take an abortion. Just like take the abortion, dude. You know what I mean?
Take it.
No, no one does that.
Yeah,
right?
Conversations don't go that. You'll probably have like fetal body parts thrown at you.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Maybe in Sam Kinnison's world, right?
I miss Sam Kinnison. If he was here now, he might be able to save all of us.
Yeah, I think also though, we wouldn't.
People.
Yeah, we might also just die of laughter. So,
or cocaine overdose, which I think is what he did that.
So in the abortion debate, no one says, quit being so sensitive about abortions.
Right.
Learn to take an abortion and quit being a snowflake. No. What they instead do is everyone produces moral reasons.
Is that because they all agree that this is a subject for moral discussion?
Yeah. I think it's because this is a place where everyone has moral feelings. In
the case of the comedy, the argument is really about whether it has a status or not. In other words, the argument is over the first question.
Yeah.
With the case of the abortion, we all agree that this is a subject of moral dispute. So the argument is over whether it has a positive moral valence or a negative moral valence.
And this is why you produce moral reasons, right? Because now you're arguing in the moral domain. And so what do? You produce reasons that have moral relevance. But the thing is, the crucial thing for me, which ties back to the first point I made about lacking in intuition. So in the comedy debate, when the accusations of oversensitivity come out, I ask, what does oversensitivity even mean, right? What does oversensitivity typically mean? Typically, if someone's oversensitive, it just means that they have a reaction where others wouldn't, right?
Right.
So they have a reaction where others wouldn't.
Not just wouldn't, but shouldn't.
And see, that's an interesting question also, because what sense of shouldn't is there here? Is this a moral sense of should? But anyway, yes, I agree with you.
Well, no, I thought it was a shouldn't in the sense of sort of that the reaction is inapt, right?
Right.
Inappropriate, not moral.
Yes,
inappropriate.
That's right.
It doesn't fit.
Yes.
Which would be the description of reacting to something as if it had a status that it didn't have, right?
Exactly.
Right. In this case.
So the idea. Yeah. Exactly. So oversensitive just means you're having a reaction where others wouldn't and shouldn't. Even being allergic, right, means precisely this. You're having a reaction to some kind of external stimulus, which you should not have, which an ordinary human being would not have if they were healthy, right?
Right.
So the use of the prevalence of terms like snowflake and being overly sensitive and learn to take a joke, right? These to me indicate accusations of you are having feelings of morality where there should be none. Just like it would be like you having feelings about justice when you go outside and you breathe the air, right?
Right. This is important because it's a subtle difference, but it's important that we make clear, because to track what we've been saying all along, it would be a mistake to say from this view that Sam Kinnison's stand-up is permissible. The point is so the argument is not, hey man, you're morally trashing this stuff and it's not morally bad, it's actually morally good, right? Or it's morally permissible. The answer is this is not a subject for moral inquiry at all, right?
Exactly.
Freaking stand-up comic routine, right?
Here's another way to see that it's not the case that this is an argument about permissibility or not. The abortion argument is one about permissibility or not, right? whether or not abortion is permissible. No one says abortion is obligatory. No one wants to say that. The argument is it's either impermissible or permissible at best, right? No one wants to say it's obligatory or super.
I would say that there are cases where I could argue it's the right thing to do. Now, whether that means, I could think of cases where I would think it would be wrong not to give someone.
That's true. You're right, actually. I see what you mean. There are some cases like that. But I would say that there's also significant disagreement between people just about permissibility and impermissibility. And within those debates, no one makes the accusations of oversensitivity or anything like that.
Because they all agree
that it has a status.
So how would you like to describe, and you do it in the essay, how do you describe the distinction that you think we want to be able to make on this front that the person who holds UMS is unable to make? So this is between normal moral disputes in which we agree that this is a moral subject, and then the dispute is over what particular moral valence, whatever it is, has. And then the other is over whether something has a moral status. So what do you call it?
I call that moral production. And because, and this actually I realized only later that this could be a little bit misleading. Because, but regardless, moral production to me is when a debate is about whether or not an action has a status at all. In other words, one group is trying to bring morality into social discourse in the first place.
Right.
Whereas moral disagreement is about once you've got morality, once you've got discourse about morality, what's the particular status of an action? So the moral disagreement takes place after moral production has already happened in a lot of cases.
And in most cases of moral disagreement, the moral production happened enough of a time ago that it's really that it never even comes up.
Yeah, pretty much. Just we all know that this thing's.
These are all perennial. A lot of these are perennial moral issues. Just
Exactly.
war, abortion. Some of them arise because new technologies emerge that make things possible that weren't before.
Yeah.
Cloning or birth control, and so you make this distinction between what we would properly call moral dispute, which is a dispute over the moral valence of an action or a process or a practice or whatever, in a frame in which we've already agreed that this is a subject for moral that has moral weight. And then the other is moral production, where what the dispute is about is whether the thing should be taken as a moral subject.
Yeah.
And thus, this is a prior debate to a moral debate.
Yeah.
And you think that's an important discussion, an important distinction to be able to make.
Yeah.
That the person who holds UMS can't make because they think everything
has a status.
Has a moral status.
They can't distinguish the different features of these debates.
Yeah, Schwitzgebels explicitly says everything has a moral status. So he's not going to be able to make any sense of the second kind of dispute, which you say is the dispute we're having right now about comedy, right?
Yeah.
Or about pronouns, right?
He can't explain why it's so fundamentally different, right? Why it has such different features.
Yeah. So your argument as to what's wrong with UMS is that it gives you trouble in these two ways. It gives you philosophical trouble in these two ways, right?
Yeah, that's right.
One
is it doesn't draw any proper, I think, distinction between lacking an intuition and having it. And second, it can't explain
lacking a moral intuition and having it.
Lacking a moral intuition and having it. Thank you. Lacking a moral intuition and having it, and the difference between these kinds of debates that we see.
It's not really two problems. It's really one problem that manifests across moral practice in two ways, in a sense.
Yeah.
Let me just say for a minute what I think is wrong with it, because it may come up later.
Yeah.
In terms of when I push you on a few things regarding your view on with regard to moral production, because what we're going to talk about next is how moral production works. We know how normal moral disputes work, and that is people just give their reasons for why they think something has a positive or a negative moral valence, right? But what's interesting is, how does moral production work? How does something that didn't have a moral standing legitimately come to take one on, right? Because that's going to allow us to examine all these current disputes, which are basically activists trying to get us to
Yeah.
Take things as more science. So let me first just say very briefly a couple of things that I think is wrong with UMS.
Yeah.
And then we'll move on to your account of moral production. So you're right in that the problems that I identify for UMS are, to a good part, are not philosophical problems, although there is one that is flat out a philosophical problem. But the one problem I have is that part of what morality is supposed to describe is admirable and unadmirable and non-admirable. What's the opposite of admirable? Contemptible. Admirable and contemptible behavior, right? Which at least should in some way give us the capacity to identify admirable and contemptible people, right?
Yeah.
It would be very strange if our estimation of a person had nothing to do with our estimation of their actions. And the problem is, and this is a problem, this is not original to me, this comes out of Susan Wolf, who wrote a really, in my view, important paper called Moral Saints.
Yeah.
The problem is that Wolf argues, I think quite compellingly, that the person who holds UMS, what she would call a moral saint, is actually not an admirable person, right?
Yeah.
So one problem I have with UMS is that the people who hold it, I find to be not only contemptible but socially toxic, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be around these people, other than other UMS types, because somebody for whom moral considerations are always overriding of all else. That means that this is a person who's not going to cultivate any other virtues.
Yeah.
As Wolf points out. And such people tend to be pedants, scolds, and bores. Right? They're people you just don't want around.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something wrong with a view of morality if holding it entails that you're not that you're not an admirable person, right?
Yeah.
There's something wrong with that, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I also loved Bernard Williams, right? Is because all of his critiques, a lot of his critiques were along these lines.
Yeah,
and we'll come to this later when we discuss actually, the conditions under which moral production is legitimate. But one thing that I loved about Williams was his examples where he showed that utilitarianism, if it's right, people are pretty shitty in the way that they are utilitarians. So, for example, he said, look. Utilitarianism is going to say that it should be an easy decision whether or not you kill the one or let the five, kill like the five or let the one die, right? It's an easy decision. You should be able to do it in a split second, right? The calculation's there. Just do it. But that should not be easy for anyone. That should never be an easy decision. It should always, in my view, and this is what I was going to tie actually to some things that I'm going to say later about courage and how that relates to kind of moral production. You should be morally uncertain in decisions like that when either one of the actions you have to take is one that on its own would be morally bad, right? You should feel something. And so Susan Wolf kind of echoes something from the same point from a different perspective, right? Bernard Williams taking it from like the perspective of kind of an emotional human component of like it really shouldn't be easy for you to make this decision between the five or the one. And Wolf is saying you'll lack any kind of virtues, generally speaking, besides these emotional ones, right?
Yeah.
Like moral uncertainty. You'll lack all sorts of virtues.
Look, a world in which Wolf says that a world in which people adhere to UMS, which to her is the moral saint, right, is a world in which there are no professional athletes, there are no world-class chefs, because all of those activities require a devotion of time and effort that you could never justify if you hold UMS to be true, right?
Yeah.
If you believe that moral considerations are always overriding, or put another way, if you believe every action has a moral status, then you always have something that you should be doing more, as opposed to perfecting your tennis game or learning, creating new recipes or whatever. So that's one problem with it. One problem with it is that UMS entails an ideal that actually we wouldn't consider an ideal. This is not a sort of person we'd want to either be or be around.
Yeah.
The second problem I have with it is that
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
I just wanted to interject to say, you said, the moral saint is the one who, buys into the universal moral status view. Yes, but I also wanted to say that for Susan Wolf, it's also, they don't just believe that all actions have moral status. They also think that as you always say, morality is overriding.
Yeah.
So they're always doing the moral thing,
right.
while also recognizing everything else.
I think that one sort of entails the other, because if you believe UMS, then it means that morality morality undergirds every activity you engage in. Yeah. And then that means you are always going to be taking moral consideration into account with regard to everything you do. And if there is a moral consideration at issue, it's part of almost the definition of what it is for something to be moral, that it's overriding, right? I mean, that's, how often do we say,
yeah,
you must follow orders unless they violate, basic principles of morality or your conscience or whatever. I mean, that's sort of, so I think actually that the moral saint falls out of a kind of a UMS, right? I mean, that's why the utilitarian can't help but be a moral saint, it seems to me. If UMS is entailed by his view. Okay, so that's one problem. So the other problem, the second problem strikes me as one of just wild impracticality. And that is that you can tell someone that every day, his kid takes a bologna sandwich to school for lunch, he's committing a terrible moral crime, right?
Yeah.
But I would bet a year's salary that's no one is going to stop eating bologna sandwiches because of this. I mean, or the number of people that stop eating is going to be so small that it's going to be. In other words, I think that this is ineffective. I mean, I think actually Williams has said this about Peter Singer, that once the moralist becomes a kind of a scold, it actually ceases to be ineffective. It actually becomes counterproductive because people chafe against it. So, you keep badgering and hammering at people on pollution, and then what they do is they go out and they buy Humvees, right, on purpose, just because they're so irritated, right? So I think that there's really an impracticality. I think if you moralize everything and you try to you kind of hold people this kind of standard, what you're just going to get is a backlash, right? And I think you see it.
The thing that's interesting is, by the way, I think that this happens more so with moral production issues than moral disagreement issues. So, for example, moralizing, and which I think is very interesting, actually, because there's a reason for this, and it makes sense with the oversensitivity stuff, right? So, like, don't you get more annoyed at someone who's overly sensitive than someone who disagrees with you vehemently? Yeah, like you've disagreed with me vehemently before, and we've kind of gotten like up in arms in each other's faces, but that's never made me like pissed off or irritated or anything like that for any significant degree. The only time you really get annoyed when someone moralizes you is when they're clearly being oversensitive, right?
When they're trying to make something moral that you don't think is.
Yeah, exactly.
They think it's wrong, and you think it's right, but that you don't think this is. Why are we talking about this? Right? It's a fucking sandwich, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and that's the thing.
Why the hell are we talking about this? In a moral context.
This reminds me of also how we get. We get irritated at oversensitive people generally, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes
they're among the most irritating people, right? I mean, it's an interesting to sort of think of, well, why is that? And it's precisely because they're trying to make something of what you think is nothing, right? I mean, so anyway, that's the sort of the second reason. I think there's a certain kind of sort of wild impracticality to this. I don't think that. I think it has tremendously diminishing returns. This kind of badgering. I'm not sure I really had much of a view about pronouns before this started, and now, I mean, I don't want to say that I'm as fierce and defiant as Jordan Peterson, but I mean, if somebody tries to force me to call somebody Z, I will refuse, right? And so, in other words, it's turned me more negative to the thing that they want me to care about, rather than made me care more about it, right? I don't even know that I had a view before, right?
Yeah.
Just because, whether, if I say, hey, brother, I mean, right?
Yeah. Exactly. These are things that we don't ordinarily think about morality in, right? How we interact with them.
And the third problem I had with it, now this is a philosophical problem, it's a conceptual problem. That it seems to me that if you're going to say that something's immoral, at some level, immorality, badness has to be conceived of as a deviation from a norm, right?
Yeah.
Which means it's got to be somewhat rare, right? I mean, if everything you do, or if 70% of the things you do are bad, if ethical vegans, environmentalists, trans activists, feminists, all these people, if they're all right, then like 80% of what most of us do on a daily basis is wrong, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is a problem in itself. In other words, I think that there's a ceiling as to how many things can be plausibly wrong or right before you get a sort of concept creep that undermines the concept, right? And what I mean is, look, if everything is right or wrong, then being right or wrong isn't particularly special. It's not something to get particularly exercised about. Yeah. But I thought the whole point of trying to raise moral consciousness was to make people think that something's a big deal.
Yeah.
Everything can't be a big deal. Right? Yeah. Only some things can be big deals. If everything's a big deal, nothing's a big deal.
Right. It's kind of like, Louis C.K. actually had a joke one time where he talked about how he said something like, for some reason, millennials seem to love extreme words. So, for example, he was like, everything is hilarious.
Right.
Right. And he looks up I think he said hilarious, but he looks up the definition of like hilarious or whatever. It's something like, laughing until you want to shit yourself. You know what I mean? It's just like something absolutely extreme. And he was like, this one girl was saying that's hilarious when her friend said something like, they wrote my name in Starbucks. They wrote my name slightly wrong, when I went in there. Oh, that's hilarious, right? If things like that are hilarious,
that makes me think you need to get out more, right? I mean, it's funny. It's funny that the dullest, most boring, uninteresting generation uses the most hyperbolic language. I mean, there's something to be said about that, right? I mean.
Now you're just trolling.
Maybe they're just trying to inflate. Maybe they recognize what a bunch of dull wits they are, and they're just trying to make themselves seem more interesting. But anyway,
I like when I'm gonna call you like the curmudgeon therapist, because your therapy of groups is just like ascribing shit to people.
It's like that Bob Newhart sketch where he just yells the therapy.
Exactly.
Stop it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I was gonna say though that similarly, like, look, if everything is hilarious to this nature, whether or not
then nothing's hilarious.
Nothing's hilarious.
There's nothing special about being hilarious.
And the word becomes to function just like cool, right? Or nice, or see you later. These are just now signals that I heard what you said, essentially, right? And gave the appropriate response.
Yeah. So, I mean, my point is that there's a certain incongruity, The whole point of moral activism is to get people to think that something's really important, right? But if every issue is like that, they can't all be. I mean, in other words, it can't be that everything is seriously important in this way. In other words, things only attach that have that kind of import, or if they're special in some way, and that, in my view, entails that they have to be in some sense, somewhat rare. And so I think that there is a purely conceptual, philosophical problem to UMS, in that I think it basically undermines the specialness of moral significance, and I think that specialness is a definitive characteristic of moral significance, right?
Yeah.
To be morally significant is to be special and important, right?
And and that's, if you think about it, like there's kind of an aesthetic appeal to that too, right? Like there's this sense in which morality, you're giving morality its proper respect. Actually,
it should be a dramatic quality.
Yeah, because the way people talk about morality makes it sound like they really want to pay complete deference to it, right? Yeah. But you can almost say, the reason I find this view of yours aesthetically appealing is because it's precisely saying that moral considerations, that not everything has moral status and that morality is kind of a more rare thing. Right. That's precisely paying it its proper respect, right? And saying, look how special this thing is, right?
Yeah.
Take it seriously when it comes up.
Yeah.
kind of
So
thing.
let's move on to the last bits. So let's focus entirely on moral production. And one of the things that when we were discussing this, so we had a lot of discussions about this before the essay went up. And one of the things I kind of pushed you on was I said, look, surely moral production, at least in principle, is legit because that's how moral progress occurs, right? In other words, what is moral progress but people coming to take as morally serious something that wasn't morally serious before, right? So in other words, the civil rights movement, the lesbian and gay rights movement that got us to the point to which we now have legal gay marriages, right?
Yeah.
These were all cases where moral production happened, right?
Yeah.
People, activists, managed to convince the public to a significant enough degree, or to a sufficient enough degree, that now the question of what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do comes up, and as a result, we don't have segregation. We don't, keep blacks at separate water fountains. We allow gay and lesbian people to get married just like everybody else.
Yeah.
So, one of the things that you need to do, and which you do in the essay, is describe the conditions for legitimate moral production. So maybe you want to talk about that for a little.
Yeah. So I should also say before we get into this, the answer will strike some as a non-answer because I'm not going to try and give necessary and sufficient conditions for when something acquires a moral status or doesn't. That's way too early in the project, and I don't think that could even be done, most likely. This is something that you and I have talked about a little bit. So instead what I do is I try to point to heuristics, like good indicators of whether or not moral production is legitimate.
Okay, so what are they?
Yeah, so the first is actually one that piggybacks off of you. I quoted your essay actually in this part of my essay. But the idea is essentially, if we look back at all of the actions that we've been discussing, these ordinary, mundane ones, the fact is they're all ubiquitous, right? Meaning everyone does them. Everyone does them.
Enormous numbers of people.
Enormous numbers of people. Yeah.
Let's not sandwiches for lunch, right?
Right. Exactly. Enormous
drive
numbers
cars.
Yes.
Or
exactly.
call people Mister, right?
Yeah. Or roll out of bed on the right or the left side.
Right.
All of these things are extremely ubiquitous. And to me, the terminology that I want to employ, which I haven't philosophically fleshed out yet, is ubiquity indicates that something's mundane or ordinary, and mundaneness indicates that it's trivial. Right?
Now, but hold on that for a minute. Now, that's where but people are going to push us, though.
Yeah.
Right? Segregation was ubiquitous in the South.
Yeah.
Did that make it trivial?
Right. So this is why, in other words, you certainly don't want to deny two things. One is moral complicity. The idea that, moral complicity is the idea that essentially you can be, even if you're not doing anything that seems overtly wrong, just being a part of some very terrible system of wrongs makes you complicit in the moral wrongdoing. So this would be, for example, if there were a ton of white people who were owning slaves and everyone's doing it, we wouldn't want to say that it just didn't have a status, right? Owning slaves.
Right.
But of course, one thing that's kind of interesting is actually in the slavery case, I'm not sure if that's necessarily one of moral production, because not everyone agreed with slavery. In fact,
slavery was controversial from the beginning. That's true.
Here's people also who didn't agree with slavery.
Yeah.
Slaves didn't, right? But either way, the point is, we don't want to deny moral complicity altogether.
That's why I chose segregation, because that really was ubiquitous in the sense that if you lived in certain states, everything you did on a daily basis involved segregation because the infrastructure was segregated, that you operated in was segregated, right? Many white people didn't own slaves.
Yeah. But
there's not a single white person who lived in one of these states that was not involved with segregation on a daily basis simply by use of the infrastructure that they were. So that's why I think it's a better example than slavery. So ubiquity by itself is not, it does not entail triviality, but it at least points towards it, right? I mean, it's a consideration, right?
It's a consideration, and some other people have recognized the significance of ubiquity, but for different reasons. Sloat in a paper and analysis back in, I think it was like the 80s or maybe even 70s. He mentions how the ancient Greeks, there doesn't seem to be any indication that any ancient Greeks felt that slavery was wrong in any way, or really thought about it as wrong in any way. And he says that this ubiquity matters for how we kind of evaluate their character and attitudes. And then he goes on to talk about exactly what that means. But yes, ubiquity is something that has been recognized as kind of philosophically significant. But I think that all it's done for philosophers so far has been a good tool to point at certain moral phenomena, but never a sufficient condition for anything.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost seems like the things that are trivial will tend to be pretty ubiquitous, but not everything that's ubiquitous is trivial, right? So it's an indicator of triviality, but it by no means entails it.
Yeah.
So go on. So ubiquity is one heuristic that you would use to sort of identify.
Yeah. So the other is looking at the activists themselves as an indicator, looking at the features of the activists, the character of the activists, to see whether or not it's likely that they're doing legitimate moral production. Okay. So the idea was, I want to hold that essentially, if the activists, the people who are pushing for moral production, have what I call moral courage, it's more likely the case that this is legitimate moral production. So moral courage here for me is different from what people typically think of as courage. And I should also say that a lot of this stuff that I'm going to say on courage I actually got from the philosopher Michelle Moody Adams at Columbia University. She writes a lot on moral progress and on kind of moral heroes who have pushed progress and the features that they kind of typically have.
Let me just, before you go on, let me just, I want to be very careful. When we say legitimate moral production, really what we're saying, what you're saying is, look, here are some heuristics that you should take into account when you're trying to decide whether to take a plea for moral production seriously. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, pretty much.
Because the legitimate might indicate that there's some realist kind of thing there, right? That, there are the genuine moral cases of production and the non-genuine ones, as if that's sort of a matter of some sort of independent reality. I mean, this is really all just about when should we take seriously activists who are pushing us in a particular direct form of moral production, and when should we say, get over it, it's just a joke, right? Or it's just a freaking sandwich, right? When is it? So one aspect is how ubiquitous is the phenomenon, right?
Yeah.
And if it's very ubiquitous, we might take some pause in terms of whether we're gonna take seriously a plea for moral production.
Yeah.
Second now has to do with the, I guess what you would call it, the earnestness of the.
Kind of, yeah.
So go on.
Yeah. So for me, the idea is you look at the activists and you see. Oh, by the way, let me back up for 1 second. I mean, you are right that right now we're predominantly talking about when should we take the activists seriously, just at like a belief level, so to speak.
Right.
But one of my at least projects in the future will be to see if whether or not these heuristics can be used as an indicator of whether or not the thing, in a realist sense or maybe an expressivist sense, actually does have a status. Because that would be the meta-ethical, like philosophically deep question.
And that actually is one I'm not particularly interested in, and that's because because of my 10-year-old kind of Wittgensteinian view of these things. I don't think there is anything above the.
Yeah, I was also going to say though.
Not right.
I was also going to say very quickly, the fact that universal moral status view is false is even more obvious on the expressivist view, because there are things that I just don't have attitudes of disapproval or approval toward at all.
Right.
Right. So,
and in the case of an expressivist, that's all there is to having a moral status, is being the sort of thing that one reacts negatively or positively to. Okay, so go on and talk about the character of activists and how that's a heuristic.
Yeah, so the idea is, I think that the activists who are pushing production need to have what I call moral courage, which is different from what people might think of when they just hear the word courage generally. Typically, for people, courage is willing to face, loss of life or extreme personal sacrifice for the sake of some principle, right? Maybe even not maybe even not for the sake of some principle, just willing to, risk your life for some noble aim, right?
Right. It has to be a noble aim because otherwise it's not courage. It's not courage. It's being rash. Right.
Yeah.
That's
the thing.
Aristotle's whole point, right?
Yeah, and that's the thing, exactly. And that's the thing is, like, if courage requires having a noble aim, it should also require achieving that aim in a noble way, right? And so here's the idea. For me, moral courage involves three components. One is, being willing to risk massive personal sacrifice. The second is exhibiting moral uncertainty when you're in morally impossible dilemmas that are a result of, the noble aim that you have. And I'll give an example in a second. And the third is feeling moral regret when you have to do something that, for example, might harm or affect an innocent bystander as a byproduct of kind of the goals that you have that are requiring courage. So, for example, to make this concrete, take a soldier or a general who's on the battlefield, right? And the general, let's assume, is engaged in some noble, just war. And the general is kind of on the battlefield, and he's going about, and he realizes that in order to advance his position in the battlefield, he might need to kill, 3 innocents with kind of a grenade shell to a house that it can clear vision for some other, like defense fortress that the opposing side has. If he ends up doing it, which very well might be required in the situation, maybe, because this should be a morally regrettable decision for him. He should feel moral uncertainty. He should feel uncertain about what he should do before he kills these civilians. And because he was uncertain when he killed them, he should feel moral regret afterward, not knowing if he made the right decision, right?
But let me ask, I mean, it's a clear example of courage, but I would like an example specifically of courage in moral production, right? Because that's not a case of moral production. So can you give me an example that involves the kind of courage that you think is indicative of legitimate moral production?
Yeah. So I would want to take Martin Luther King. I think he's a good example here.
So what did he sacrifice? In what sense was he hesitant? And in what sense did he evince regret?
Yeah. So for me, well, the interesting thing about King is, he obviously had this policy of non-violence and non-retaliation. But the sense in which King exhibited courage is, one, he clearly had a noble aim. The second is, in my mind, the fact that he had this policy of nonviolence manifests that he had, he had some moral uncertainty about what he should do, right? Because, by the way, there are times when he even talked about how, you can understand why someone might want to use violence, right? But he still felt in the end that wasn't the way that he should go.
You can actually say that the nonviolence is an expression of both the uncertainty and the regret.
Exactly. Right? That's exactly what I'm thinking. It's an expression of both of those things.
But something just occurred to me. You said the cause is noble, but doesn't that then already presume that moral production has been successful? In other words, do you risk a certain circularity? So
this is where an interesting question here would be, does my view actually require realism then, right? Because the idea would be, if the cause being noble could be a success condition, so to speak, that it is a fact that there is a moral status here now, and Martin Luther King had kind of latched onto that, and so successfully he had a noble cause, right, in some kind of objective sense. I'm not sure what I want to say about that yet. This is where, again, this is workshop style conversation, right? Fine. I'm not sure what I want to say about that.
That's fine.
But I think that, that's a totally legitimate point. What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on this?
See, because I've made a virtue of being fast and loose. I don't mind circularity. In other words, I'm perfectly happy to say that that the judgment that one has moral courage is an indication that the thing that they're activists about is morally worthy. And in order for something to be morally worthy in terms of moral production, the person has to be courageous in presenting it. I don't have a problem with that. That sort of circularity, I would argue, is not vicious. But
that's interesting.
But it doesn't. I don't want to get sidetracked on it. I mean, I just wanted to raise it as a point. I'm sure there's quite a smart audience in blogging heads, and I'm sure someone would have picked that up right away. Wait a minute, how is he calling that noble if we haven't decided whether the moral production yet is
definitely.
And I would argue that it's the circularity that you find in a family of concept. It's not a vicious circularity. The way that there is no way in. It's a bootstrapping sort of thing, right? I mean, simultaneously ask yourself whether you think this person is exhibiting courage, and part of asking yourself that is whether you think this thing really is worth something or whether you just think it's trivial, right? So as long as we're not in the world of necessary and sufficient conditions, I don't know that I think it's necessarily a problem, but I wanted to raise it.
So for me, one of the reasons why the courage thing really matters to me is, I was thinking about, again, Bernard Williams kind of stuff, about doing things for the right reason, right? Not just doing the right action, but doing things for the right reason. So even if the utilitarian's correct, right, Bernard Williams wants to say, it doesn't matter because you're not doing stuff for the right reason. You're doing, you're saving the 5 because of some calculus, not because of some kind of human emotive component that kind of relates to your character or expresses your character, that you're concerned about everyone who's involved, right? And the idea is, I really like that point. I think that Bernard Williams has a point about doing things for the right reasons, and I think that exhibiting moral courage shows that you do things for the right reasons. It almost gives you a good testimonial epistemic standing to me, right? Yeah. I'm going to trust your testimony much more if you're doing things for the Bernard Williams right reasons. And exhibiting courage to me indicates you're doing things for the right reasons.
Right. No, I think that we see this across a broad spectrum of different areas of discourse. I'm going to take a discussion with a theist much more seriously if that theist exhibits some healthy self-skepticism and self-doubt than if he doesn't.
Yeah.
Which is why I tend to have no respect whatsoever for fundamentalists, precisely because I think that their position is so ill-considered that they don't even have the normal sorts of healthy skepticism that one would expect from somebody in consideration of anything, let alone something as hugely important, right? In other words, this is something you should be even more careful about, not less. And if you're less careful about your commitments to supernatural entities that run the universe than you are about deciding what shoes to put on in the morning, then I would say you've got a very screwed up way of thinking about things. And so I do think that across a broad spectrum of areas, we view, really what you're describing with courage is almost a kind of moral diligence in it's a recognition that to call something moral is a big deal.
Yeah.
That it will involve condemning people.
Yes.
And perhaps even inflicting punishments on them.
That's right.
And that therefore it ought to be taken damn seriously.
Yeah.
And given very careful consideration with full recognition of the gravity. And I think that, one of the things I really like about your invoking this is that one of the things that I find most appalling about the current crop of, unfortunately, to a large extent, millennial activists is that they don't take any of that seriously at all. They think that it's just fine.
Exactly.
To hurl these things at people, completely irrespective of the damage and destruction it causes.
Yeah.
To their livelihoods, to their employment, to their relations, to their, this guy Ronson, I forget his first name,
John Ronson.
Yeah, wrote this book. You've just been shamed or something like that.
Yes, you've been publicly shamed.
Yeah, about Twitter, about the way that Twitter is used for this.
Yeah,
and I don't want to put too far, but these strike me as just some of the worst people in the world.
And here's the thing. It's not even just Twitter, right? This people get called out on college campus for college campus protests all the time, right?
Yeah.
Trying to get people to resign, trying to force them to resign,
and
just publicly lampooning people. And the thing is, this is sometimes necessary in moral struggles, in moral progress.
Yes, but it's very grave. It has to be taken with tremendous gravity. That's right.
Exactly. It should always be something that you're morally uncertain about, and you should feel moral regret afterward.
Right. And that moral uncertainty and that potential for regret should constrain what you do, right?
Exactly.
The way you act. I see no such constraint whatsoever. If anything, it seems almost gleeful, right?
Yeah.
Which is a reason that I think that none of the current crop of moral activism is going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, and you can also see that they're at the point now where they're not even trying to persuade anymore. They're just trying to bully and force.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, in Canada, they've now passed a bill that requires you to use certain gender pronouns, or else be subject to legal sanction. New York City has a similar law. I doubt that the ethical vegans are going to be able to make these kinds of inroads because there's just too much money interest involved in the industries. And in other words, the industries are too big even for the ethical vegans to go after because there's too much money involved. It's much easier to go after some poor jerk who called someone sir, right?
Yeah.
I think
this is exactly where I was going with it as well, because that was something that bothered me. I wrote an essay for the Electric Agora back in, I think it was actually 2015, the first year we started.
Pretty early, yeah.
I think it was the first year we started, and it was on what I call the title of the essay was "Ruminations on Millennials: The Case for Moral Arrogance." Right, and moral arrogance for me was precisely the opposite of like feeling moral uncertainty and moral regret. It's when you're way too confident in your moral views. It's like it's categorizing a Bernard Williams intuition, right? Yeah. About moral arrogance is when you are way too confident that you're a good person, right? And that you're doing good things.
Yeah.
And this was something that really did bother me a lot.
And not just that your cause is not just right, but so important, so morally significant that it justifies a kind of a slash and burn approach.
Exactly.
To dealing with other people, is really hard for me to sort of stomach.
So that's the thing is, I got this. I had this impression when I wrote that essay that like the millennials that you're talking about, the kind of college campus activists, they adopted only half of their civil rights heroes. Right, a lot of the movements that they're pushing are clearly like inspired by the same ethos of the civil rights.
It's 60s campus activism redux, but somehow they missed half of it, right?
Exactly. They got the aims right. And that's the thing that like gives their kind of position some intuitive appeal, right? Is it's right in line with all the civil rights aims of protecting the kind of oppressed groups and the people who are worst off. But they didn't adopt any of their heroes' characters, right? They didn't adopt Martin Luther King's character,
or at least a lot of them. Yeah,
a lot of them.
Yeah.
So that was the thing that really bothered me, and that is actually precisely something that inspired the moral courage comment. Was I think this is a clear instance where it comes out that I'm not going to trust you if you don't have this kind of moral courage that involves moral uncertainty and moral regret.
Right. So just to sum up, and then I want to move to the last thing, which I want to push you on this a little bit. Sum up at this point, moral production, that is taking something, an activity or a practice or whatever that hitherto has been not considered to be morally significant, and trying to convince people that it is. Two heuristics that you kind of have to look at in trying to decide whether to take such efforts seriously, to embrace those efforts. One is how ubiquitous is the activity that we're talking about, because its ubiquity might be an indication of its triviality, right? Of its moral triviality, right? Eating lunch is not trivial in a certain sense because you have to do it. It's part of being a healthy human being, but it's trivial in the sense of whether your sandwich is chicken salad or peanut butter. the second thing is whether the people making the case for the moral production are, in a certain sense, are courageous and in that sense, really, in a sense, being scrupulous, right? I mean, they're being careful. They're exhibiting healthy skepticism, an awareness of the gravity of assigning moral predicates to things in terms of what that then entails in terms of how one deals with other people, and taking all that very seriously. So those are the two indicators. Now, here's what I want to ask you, and this may either indicate a difference between us, or it may indicate simply something that you're just not talking about in this paper, but that you do have a view on that's roughly similar to mine. And that the question is this: given that you outline or describe at least the heuristics for what we would call recognizing legitimate cases of moral production, one could at least in principle imagine that all the current cases of moral production that we see are done in the legitimate fashion, right?
Yeah.
And in other words, what I'm asking is, given that you allow for legitimate moral production, could we not wind up perfectly legitimately with an actual UMS universe? In other words, if there's a legitimate way to do moral production, then one could easily imagine a world in which we wind up with a situation in which universal moral status is true and perfectly legitimate, because the way that things acquired the status was earnest and careful and well considered and all that. And in my view, there is simply an inherent problem in itself with UMS beyond the question of how one gets to it, right?
Yeah.
What I want to know is, do you think that there's an inherent problem, or do you think, no, the problem is how you get to it? If you get to it in this legitimate way, fine, we'll have morally pervaded lives, right? What is your view, or is this just something that you just didn't address and you don't?
So I didn't address, and I hadn't thought about it too deeply, but I agree with you that you can't have too much morality. The UMS, I don't think.
You agree with that?
I agree with you that if you have UMS, if you have a world with where all things have a status, and we're talking about morality for everything, it undermines the concept. I agree with that. Just like with the kind of concept of something being hilarious, right? It kind of loses its significance and its function altogether and its meaning if you use it just in a ubiquitous, all-encompassing way.
So would you then want to impose any other limits on moral production? I mean, I guess I'm just, what I'm not seeing is, I mean, look, it could happen that all the current trans activist movement, ethical vegans, all this stuff could acquire an MLK type leadership that do this the right way, right?
Yeah.
And successfully moralize more and more of our lives. What conceptual resources do you have to explain what's wrong with that, even when it's done the right way, according to what you describe in the essay?
Yeah, I wonder. I'm going to speculate here because this is literally coming out of my ass right now. Because this isn't something I'd really thought of.
I have asked you this before, though. I mean.
Yeah. But again, just don't really have kind of any sophisticated view on this so far. But I wonder if the resources that one could draw on is something similar to what you've done in other criticisms of kind of social justice circles. How people always want to say things like, X is a social construct, and so I can choose what X is, right? I can just by myself, I get to choose whether or not I am, this gender or whatever it might be. Whether or not I
had a paper called Self-Made that I published.
Yeah. Whether or not
which I said there's something a little weird about arguing that something is, on the one hand, a social construct, but then saying that it's entirely determined by me.
Yeah. Right? In other words, social construction doesn't imply self-determination.
Right. Social construction to me implies social negotiation. Right.
Yeah.
And if gender, let's say, is socially constructed, that means that you don't get to just declare what you are, that's a matter of public negotiation, right? So anyway, yeah. So how are you going to bring that to bear on this?
Well, so I was thinking something like what you're pointing out is that in a certain sense, the analogy here could be drawn between the activists and the self, right? The self can't just determine by themselves what's kind of like what their identity is or something like that, whether or not they're beautiful, whether or not they're funny, whether or not they're an asshole. They don't get to decide that by themselves, even though those things might be social constructions.
Yeah.
And similarly, the activists don't get to decide for themselves what kind of ends up being legitimate just in virtue of doing things in a morally courageous and good way. Now, the problem is, what are the things that push back, right? What are the things that constrain? In your view, in the kind of self-determination, social construction debate, it's society that pushes back, right? But in principle for you, society could agree with every one of the social justice activist claims, presumably, right?
Right.
So
I would argue that there still would be something wrong with having too much, right? That then gets at those other criticisms that I made. That
exactly.
Regardless of how legitimately the things were acquired, there just can be too much of it, right?
Well, that's what I was going to say. I don't have available to me society pushing back in the same way that you do, because there could still be a world, since you're asking in principle, there could still be a world where society concedes to all of the activists' demands, right, or what they're pushing for, and the activists are doing their activism legitimately in some sense, and so you get this world of universal moral status. So I'm wondering if actually the only way that I can constrain this view is if I do adopt a kind of realist approach, right?
Or if you accept my sort of practical criticisms of it, right?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's nothing that would prevent you from taking on board the criticisms that I've made, and that is things like it's impractical, it's going to wind up producing, resistance and resentment. It's and perhaps even the opposite of what you want. It entails a kind of concept creep, which then undermines the very notion that moral issues are special. In other words, there's nothing preventing you from adopting those sorts of practical constraints on how much morality there can be, no matter how it's produced, right?
Yeah. No, that's true. But I thought that what you really wanted was less of a point about, practically speaking, why we shouldn't try and to make the world of UMS, and more a philosophical position of, in your view, could there be UMS?
Right. Well, I didn't have a view one way or the other. What I wanted to know is whether you envisaged something that you were going to build into this theory that, in a sense, add to the theory of your account of moral production that would sort of constrain how much moral production there can be.
I like that. Yes, I like that a lot. You could almost say there has to be, at a certain point, there has to be like, a kind of zero-sum thing where it's like, if I put in one moral production activism, I got to do some kind of moral deletion too.
I wonder if you could actually build that into your conception of courage, because your conception of moral courage includes things like healthy skepticism, right?
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps it also needs to, maybe there needs to be a sort of a prudential dimension to moral courage. That is, one thing the activist does have to consider is, how many moral crusades are there going on, and are we going to morally exhaust the audience, so to speak? I mean, maybe
in other words,
you don't want to release your video game on the same day that 5 other really AAA games are coming out, just simply because your sales are going to be bad. Maybe it's also up to the moral activist who's engaged in serious production that we should take seriously, to sort of evaluate the landscape and say, is this really the best time for this? I mean, look, I understand. I feel very passionately about this. It is, though, however, a freaking bologna sandwich. And, since I got the trans people down in the office down the hall screaming their heads off, maybe I just keep my mouth shut for a little while until they're done and everybody's had a chance to digest that one before now I throw at them the next thing, right? I mean, couldn't we include wisdom, a kind of wisdom?
Yes. I think you could, because also, I mean, it's clearly the case that some virtues can't manifest if the person has too many defects in other ways, right? Like, if you're just stupid, it's going to be really hard to call you virtuous in a lot of different ways, right? Like,
it requires practical wisdom.
Yeah. So, I mean, for example, here's one case. It's like, there's this person who's just really, really not bright. Okay, they're just kind of foolish, and they're driving along the road and they see 5 people drowning. They're in a van, and they could easily save all 5, But for some reason, they just like don't see that they can save all five, so they just kind of take one to the hospital and leave the rest, right? You'd be like, there's like really something wrong here. I mean, like, even though, the person saved someone, this guy's just like pretty dumb, and there's something wrong going on here. And you could say that, like, maybe in a sense, the relevant virtue that's manifested in saving people is kind of undermined in some way.
Yeah, right.
Through being stupid like that, right?
Yeah.
And stupidity can come in all sorts of ways. One of them being here, like practical considerations, just completely, going past your head.
Yeah.
And so I think I agree with that, and I like that a lot. Let's just build into my view of courage everything that'll help my view.
No, but I wouldn't want to overload it. But I do think because of the way you characterized it, it does seem to include a kind of prudence already, right?
Yeah.
The requirement of both healthy skepticism and concern about the effects of one's activism that manifests itself as the potential for regret seems to me to bespeak a kind of prudence on the part of the activist, right?
You know what? Actually, this is built into. I can't believe I didn't think this. I mean, the definition of moral uncertainty builds this in. What it means to be morally uncertain is to have uncertainty about what you should do.
Have a certain wisdom.
When you have all of the non-normative facts at hand.
Yeah.
When you know all of the practical facts. You know all the practical facts. You know all of the facts about the world. And you're still uncertain about what you should do.
Right.
So it actually does require for its definition, that you kind of know all the relevant facts in some, useful sense of know here.
Yeah.
Obviously not some strong Cartesian.
But I would argue it goes beyond knowledge of facts. I mean, wisdom also involves a kind of a sense for, that in my work, I love these. I love and think that these sort of intangibles are often the most important ones. I mean, Aristotle goes through endless sort of discussion of practical reason and sort of its application to morals. But actually, the most important thing with respect to morals winds up being perception.
Yeah.
The ability to actually see what the right thing to do is in a situation, which he only describes in one tiny little passage involving a baker deciding when bread is well baked enough. And I think that, in this case, there's something similar at hand. It's not just about knowing the relevant facts. It's about having a good enough sense of your social environment that when you've reached the too much point, right?
Yeah.
And now it's so morally noisy right now that if I was an activist who had the kind of wisdom we're talking about, now would not be when I would be doing it, right?
Yeah.
Simply because it's very hard to see how you're going to really make any sort of a quality appeal in the current environment where it's basically just a lot of screaming and yelling and accusing and pointing and demanding and all this sort of other stuff. And
one could also say it puts you in a better epistemic position because, like, there's a bandwagon effect that we all know about, right? I mean, once the moral bandwagon starts going, it's really easy to jump on and be misled about like what is actually a moral issue and what's not.
And I assume that when you said healthy, when you mean by healthy skepticism, that includes that you could be wrong.
Yeah.
The fact that I feel so strongly about this and think that I have really good reasons, I nonetheless could be wrong. And part of what should make me realize that is that a fuck ton of people don't think so, right?
Yeah.
It should give me pause. I mean, and that's the other thing about ubiquity. It should give me pause.
Yes.
If my view entails that every single kid's lunchbox is a moral catastrophe, that should give me pause, right? I'm not saying that means it has to be wrong. But it should give me tremendous pause. I should be saying, gosh,
as a matter of wisdom.
This is so obvious. Why are all these other people, not all of whom are stupid, or monsters? Why is this not, evident to the, or maybe there's something I'm missing, or maybe there are some further considerations, or that natural healthy hesitation. And think about it, how rare that is. I mean, it's a measure of how poorly most contemporary activism would live up to your criteria. Yeah. They're not really criteria, heuristics for moral production, as to how few of them you could identify as having that kind of thoughtful.
I know. Yeah. And it's really sad too, right? Because I mean, it just means we don't really have any moral heroes these days.
No,
everyone just kind of a moral saint in the
we have tribal leaders, right? We have
yeah
moral saints within their own communities, but that don't translate across. They're not saints to anybody else, right? And so, you know, everyone's got their sort of totems that they hold up, but nobody's persuaded by each other's totems.
yeah
And, I don't think I've seen moral discourse in a worse condition
yeah
than it is today. And I think a large of it has to do with this issue, which is interesting that this issue is really not one that moral philosophers are discussing at all, right?
See, what's kind of funny is my thought
Sloat was actually surprised at the whole discussion, right? It hadn't occurred to him, right?
Once it occurred to him, he liked the idea. Yeah. But no, it hadn't. But you know, the thing is, I remember I was watching this open Yale course on the history of.
Like a MOOC?
Yeah, it's a MOOC. Open Yale courses, great place to just take some, you know, introductory courses on whatever you want from Yale faculty. But they're just video lectures. And this one professor, his name was something Snowden. He was doing a course on the history of epidemiological disease. And one thing that I gleaned from the course was, you know, some of the biggest advancements in medicine have happened when epidemiologies occurred, because they allowed us to see qualitatively, given how widespread the phenomenon was, patterns that we couldn't see before. So, for example, you know, we give up the the contagion theory of disease and move to the germ theory of disease. We figure out things like inoculation and vaccination only when enough people are dying that we start to see statistical effect,
right?
Kind of thing. And similarly, I feel like, honestly, part of the reason why maybe philosophers haven't paid as much attention to this is because it's kind of it's become now it's become an epidemic. It's now getting pretty widespread, but before maybe it wasn't so bad. I know that there were authors who were starting to pick up on this earlier, but they were kind of fewer and far between, right? Alistair McIntyre was picking up on this kind of stuff in After Virtue. You've mentioned Joan Didion before, right?
Oh, yeah. Joan Didion actually has a paper, an essay from Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which is from the 60s. It's just titled On Morality. And her main point is that there's way too much moral talk. And this was in the 60s. And she thought that it was indication of a certain kind of frivolity, of moral frivolity. You know, that's the other thing, is that something that's, you know, this is the backside to what my point about, you know, what's wrong with too much morality is that too much morality makes morality trivial, right?
Yeah.
And so, yes, I mean, it's not, we're not the first ones to broach the subject, but it really has not been a subject in academic philosophy.
Well, that's the thing is, I also think it's going to resonate more, you know, a lot now, precisely because it's a really big epidemic now. I mean, this is front and center.
It's becoming an epidemic within academic philosophy. And
Exactly.
I mean, this recent ridiculous fiasco with this woman, Rebecca Tuvel, who in some feminist journal, in Hypatia, which is a feminist journal, published an article at least making an analogy between transracialism and transgenderism, the idea being, look, if gender and race are both social constructs, if I can change my gender, why can't I change my race? And what she was put, the moral ringer that she was put through by professional philosophers, not a Twitter mob.
Yeah.
Not a bunch of not some millennial twits, right? But full professors, right?
Some, by the way, some who were on her previous dissertation committee,
right?
On her committee.
And that's not the only case. I mean, you have a number of people in the profession where this is almost their job, is to become the Twitter mob of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
Right. This guy up in Canada, what's his name? Ichigawa, whatever his name is. I mean, there's a bunch of these people who have now become, in a sense, within philosophy, these kinds of professional moral activists. And so maybe it's now starting to get some attention within academic. Maybe, in other words, maybe this is an opportune time now to raise this.
Yeah. This was actually exactly what Michael Sloat told me. He said, "I think
in the cloister now." You know,
he said, "I think the community is ready for this now."
Yeah. Well, Dan, this was really interesting. I really want to thank you.
Thank you, man. This was awesome.
Really enjoyed this, and We will put up links to all the things we've talked about. Obviously, both of our essays, some of the other essays that we mentioned. I'll link to Susan Wolf's Moral Saints. Anything that you have in mind, maybe send me the link for the
I will.
quote.
I'll also send you the link for some of the Michelle Moody Adams papers.
Yeah, anything that you want, we'll put up so that the audience can do some reading on their own on this stuff and supplement and complement the discussion that we've had.
It was nice doing a dialogue with you when I wasn't in my mouse room
in your lab doing this.
I'm like,
yeah, you finally moved into the realm of respectable adulthood now.
You say that, but you haven't really looked at the cubicle area I'm working in. So.
Yeah, that's a typical grad student office, right? I mean, that's,
yeah, it is pretty typical.
And you're in Miami, so I mean, it's not like anyone's really going to weep for you. All you have to do is like walk outside and walk 50 yards, and you're surrounded year round by beautiful things, not wearing very much.
If I were upset by this man, you would rightfully call me overly sensitive. I'd take that.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.
Likewise, Dan.
All right, ciao.
See you soon.